You shouldn't be washing dishes at 2:30 in the morning, but here you are anyway. The steam from the industrial dishwasher filled the cramped kitchen of Bella Vista, a high-end restaurant on the 40th floor of Meridian Tower. Carlos Mendoza wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve, his hands red and raw from the constant exposure to scalding water and harsh chemicals. The dinner rush had ended hours ago, but Carlos remained. There were always more dishes, more pots, more endless stacks of plates that needed to be scrubbed clean. At 54, his back ached constantly from hunching over the deep sinks. His feet throbbed in his worn work boots that had seen better days 3 years ago, and his hands were permanently stained from years of grease, detergent, and the relentless cycle of wash, rinse, repeat. This was his second job. During the day, he worked construction when he could find it, but the work had become scarcer as younger men with stronger backs and no families to support took the positions he once held. The restaurant paid $11 an hour, cash under the table, no benefits, no sick days, no insurance. But it was steady work, and Carlos had learned long ago that steady work, no matter how humble or backbreaking, was better than no work at all. He had been washing dishes at Bella Vista for 3 years now, invisible to the wealthy diners who spent more on a single bottle of wine than Carlos made in a week. These were people who drove cars worth more than his annual salary, who wore watches that cost more than his rent, who spoke casually about vacation homes and stock portfolios while Carlos scrubbed the remnants of their meals from bone china plates. The kitchen staff treated him with grudging respect. He was reliable, never complained, always showed up even when he was sick, and stayed as late as necessary to finish the job. The head chef, a temperamental man named Francois, who screamed in both English and French when orders backed up, had grudgingly admitted that Carlos was the most dependable employee they'd ever had. But to the servers, the managers, and especially the customers, Carlos might as well have been a machine tucked away in the back corner where no one had to think about him. Carlos didn't mind the invisibility. In fact, he preferred it. It meant he could work in peace, listening to his small radio playing Spanish music while he cleaned, thinking about his family, making plans for the extra money he might earn if he picked up a weekend shift at the construction site. He had 5 children and 7 grandchildren scattered across Atlanta and beyond. His oldest son, Miguel, was a supervisor at a warehouse in Marietta, working his way up from loading dock to management over 15 years. His daughter, Elena, worked as a housekeeper at 3 different hotels, cycling between shifts with barely enough time to sleep. His son, Roberto, had joined the army and was stationed in Germany, sending home pictures of places Carlos could only dream of visiting. His daughter Carmen was taking classes to become a dental hygienist while working at a daycare center, juggling textbooks and toddlers with the determination of someone who refused to let circumstances define her future. And his youngest, Sophia, was struggling to pay for nursing school while working 2 part-time jobs, one at a grocery store, another at a medical supply company. None of them knew exactly how hard Carlos worked to help them all. He'd slip Elaine $200 when her car needed repairs, telling her it was money he'd saved from overtime. He'd help Miguel with his rent when work was slow, claiming he'd won a small lottery ticket. He'd send packages to Roberto overseas filled with the American snacks he missed, using money Carlos saved by eating the same lunch of rice and beans for weeks. He'd been saving for months to help Sophia with her tuition, putting aside every extra dollar he could spare, sometimes skipping his own meals to add a few more bills to the envelope hidden in his dresser drawer. Pride wasn't about recognition or status or having your name on a business card. Pride was about family, about providing, about never giving up, even when your body screamed for rest and your mind whispered that maybe it was time to admit defeat. The last pot was finally clean when Carlos heard the elevator chime outside the kitchen. He glanced at the industrial clock on the wall, 2:47 a.m. The restaurant had been closed for hours, and the cleaning crew had already come and gone. The servers had counted their tips and headed home to their own lives. Even Francois had left, muttering something about early morning deliveries and incompetent suppliers. Maybe it was Richard, the security guard, making his final rounds. Richard was a good man, close to retirement, who always took time to ask about Carlos's family and share stories about his own grandchildren. Sometimes he'd bring Carlos coffee from the machine in the lobby, claiming he'd made too much and didn't want it to go to waste. Carlos dried his hands on his apron and walked toward the dining room, intending to let whoever it was know that the kitchen was closed and cleaned for the night. The restaurant after hours was eerily quiet, with only the city lights streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows providing illumination. The expensive tables sat empty, chairs pushed in with military precision, crystal glasses gleaming under the dim emergency lighting. What he saw made his blood freeze. A man in an expensive suit was standing near the hostess station, swaying dangerously like a ship in rough waters. As Carlos watched, the man stumbled forward, clutching his chest, his face contorted in pain that went beyond mere intoxication. His briefcase hit the marble floor with a loud crash that echoed through the empty restaurant, scattering papers across the dining room like fallen leaves. Carlos recognized him immediately. Richard Blackstone, CEO of Meridian Industries, the man who owned the building, whose company employed thousands of people across 3 states, whose portrait hung in the lobby 40 floors below next to a plaque listing his numerous achievements and charitable contributions. Carlos had seen him a few times over the years, usually surrounded by an entourage of assistants and executives, moving through the restaurant like royalty, reviewing his domain. The local newspapers wrote about him regularly. Business deals worth millions, charity galas where single donations exceeded Carlos's yearly income, expansion plans that created jobs for hundreds. He was the kind of man who appeared on magazine covers and gave interviews about market trends and economic forecasts. He was successful in ways that men like Carlos could only imagine. Now Richard was collapsing, his knees buckling as he grabbed desperately at a nearby chair for support. His breathing was labored, desperate, each intake of air seeming to require tremendous effort. His lips were starting to turn blue, and beads of sweat covered his forehead despite the air conditioning. This wasn't exhaustion from a long day or stress from high-stakes meetings. This wasn't even the effects of too much wine at a business dinner. This was a heart attack. Carlos had seen this before. His father-in-law had died of a massive heart attack when Carlos was 32, collapsing in their backyard during a family barbecue on a sunny Sunday afternoon. There had been no warning, no time to call for help, no chance to say goodbye. One moment he was laughing with his grandchildren, helping them with their piñata, the next he was gone. Carlos had performed CPR then too, frantically pumping on his father-in-law's chest while his wife screamed and children cried. But it had been too late. The paramedics arrived 20 minutes later to confirm what everyone already knew. Carlos wasn't going to let that happen again. Not when he might actually make a difference this time. He ran across the dining room, his work boots slipping slightly on the polished floor that he himself had helped maintain over the years. Sir, can you hear me? He called out in heavily accented English, kneeling beside Richard on the cold marble. Richard's eyes were wide with terror, unfocused and panicked in a way that spoke of someone watching their own mortality approach. Can't breathe. He gasped, his voice barely audible above his labored breathing. Help me, please. Carlos had never taken a first aid class. He'd never been trained in CPR or emergency medicine. The hospital had offered free classes to the community, but Carlos had always been working, always had a shift somewhere, always had something more immediately pressing than learning skills he hoped he'd never need. But he'd watched enough medical shows while eating his lunch breaks, and more importantly, he'd lived through the helpless feeling of watching someone die when help didn't come fast enough. He positioned his hands on Richard's chest, trying to remember what he'd seen on television and in movies. Push hard, push fast, don't stop. He began chest compressions, counting under his breath in Spanish the way his mother had taught him to count when he was nervous as a child. Uno, dos, tres, cuatro, cinco, seis. With his free hand, Carlos fumbled for his phone, an old smartphone with a cracked screen that barely held a charge and took forever to boot up. His fingers shook as he dialed 911, his English becoming more heavily accented under stress the way it always did when he was frightened or overwhelmed. Please, I need ambulance, he said when the operator answered, trying to speak clearly despite his panic. Meridian Tower, 40th floor, Bella Vista restaurant. Big emergency. The CEO, he having heart attack. Very bad. Sir, what's your name? The dispatcher asked, her voice calm and professional. Carlos Mendoza. I work in kitchen. I wash dishes here. Are you trained in CPR, Carlos? No, senora, but I try anyway. You're going to die if I don't do something. Please, send help quick. Okay, Carlos, you're doing the right thing. I'm going to walk you through this step by step. Keep doing compressions exactly like you're doing. Push hard and fast, at least 2 inches deep into his chest. Don't stop, even if you get tired. Carlos followed the instructions, sweat beading on his forehead despite the restaurant's powerful air conditioning. His arthritis screamed in protest, shooting pain up his arms with each compression. His back ached from the awkward position, bent over Richard's prone form on the hard marble floor. But he didn't stop. Richard's life was literally in his hands, and Carlos had spent his entire life understanding the weight of responsibility. Come on, Mr. Blackstone, Carlos whispered between compressions, speaking to him in the gentle tone he used with his grandchildren when they were scared. You got familia, right? You got people who love you, who need you. Don't give up now. Fight. Richard's skin was cold and clammy beneath Carlos's hands. His expensive suit was wrinkled and disheveled, his perfectly styled hair now matted with sweat. His luxury watch caught the light from the city beyond the windows, a reminder of the vast difference in their circumstances that seemed irrelevant now. This wasn't the powerful CEO who made decisions affecting thousands of lives and millions of dollars. This was just a man, frightened and dying, who needed someone to fight for him. Carlos, is he responding at all? The dispatcher asked, her voice a lifeline in the terrifying silence. He tried to talk, but no good. His color very bad, like gray. Please, how long for ambulance to come here? They're in the building now, Carlos. 40th floor is a long way up, but they're coming as fast as they can. You're doing an amazing job. Don't stop. The elevator seemed to take forever. Carlos's arms burned with effort, but he didn't stop. He talked to Richard constantly, partly to keep him conscious and partly to keep himself from panicking, partly because the silence felt too much like death approaching. You're going to be okay, senor. The doctors, they're going to take good care of you. You're going to go home to your wife, your children. My Sophia, she's studying to be nurse. She tell me the heart, it's strong muscle. It can heal if you don't give up. Richard's eyes flickered, and Carlos thought he saw recognition there, a spark of awareness in the midst of the medical crisis. That's right. You listening to me. Good. You stay with me. Help is almost here. Me papa, Carlos continued, his voice growing stronger as he found his rhythm. He always tell me, when somebody need help, you don't think about who they are or what they got or where they come from. You just help. Is the right thing to do. Is what makes us human. When the paramedics finally burst through the restaurant entrance, they found Richard conscious but weak, his breathing shallow but steady. Carlos had been performing CPR for 17 minutes straight, and his shirt was soaked with sweat, his arms trembling from exhaustion. Sir, we'll take over now, the lead paramedic said, a woman with kind eyes and efficient movements who immediately began assessing Richard's condition. Carlos didn't want to stop. What if Richard's heart stopped again the moment he let go? What if he died because Carlos wasn't strong enough to keep going? What if this moment of hope was just a cruel prelude to loss? Sir, you need to step back now. You did an incredible job, but we need room to work with our equipment. Carlos reluctantly moved aside, watching as the paramedics took over with practiced precision. They checked vitals, administered oxygen, started an IV, attached monitors that beeped reassuringly. Their movements were coordinated, professional, everything Carlos is desperate. Efforts hadn't been. As they prepared Richard for transport to the hospital, his eyes found Carlos's across the small crowd of medical personnel. You, Richard whispered. his voice barely audible above the medical equipment and radio chatter. "You saved my life." Carlos shook his head, suddenly self-conscious about his stained uniform, his calloused hands, his broken English. "Just doing what's right, senor. Anyone would do the same." Richard reached out weakly, and Carlos took his hand without thinking. It was soft, uncalloused, nothing like Carlos's work-hardened fingers that bore the scars of years in kitchens and construction sites. "What's your name?" "Carlos Mendoza." "Carlos Mendoza," Richard repeated slowly, as if memorizing it, making it important. "I won't forget this. I promise you, I won't forget." The paramedics wheeled Richard toward the elevator, and Carlos stood alone in the dining room. The scattered papers from Richard's briefcase lay around him like fallen leaves, corporate letterheads and financial documents that represented more money than Carlos would see in a lifetime. Stock reports, merger documents, investment portfolios. A world of wealth and power that existed in a completely different universe from Carlos's daily struggles. Carlos carefully gathered the papers, noting the corporate letterheads and dollar amounts that made his head spin. He stacked them neatly and placed them on the hostess station where security would find them, then returned to the kitchen to finish cleaning up. He had work to do, and the morning prep crew would be arriving in a few hours to start the cycle all over again. But as Carlos scrubbed the last of the pots, his hands shook. Not from the adrenaline, though that was part of it. Not from the fear, though he'd been terrified. But from the memory of his father-in-law's death, from the knowledge that this time he'd been able to do something. This time he'd made a difference. This time help had arrived in time. Carlos didn't tell anyone about what happened that night. When the morning crew arrived and found the dining room slightly disheveled, he simply said there had been a small emergency, but it was taken care of. When the restaurant manager asked about the papers on the hostess station, Carlos explained that someone had dropped them and he had collected them for safekeeping. He went home to his small apartment, kissed his sleeping wife Maria, and tried to get a few hours of rest before his construction job. But he couldn't stop thinking about Richard's eyes, about the trust and gratitude he'd seen there, about the moment when a powerful man had become simply human. 3 weeks later, Carlos was in the middle of the lunch rush, fighting to keep up with the endless stream of dirty plates, when Tony, the kitchen manager, appeared at his station with an expression Carlos had never seen before. "Carlos, there's someone here to see you." Carlos looked up from the industrial sink, confused and immediately worried. No one ever came to see him at work. His family knew not to disturb him during his shifts, and he didn't have friends who would visit him at the restaurant. The only times people came looking for kitchen staff was when there was trouble, immigration raids, workplace violations, someone in the family hurt or sick. "Who is it?" Carlos asked, drying his hands on his apron while his mind raced through possibilities. Had something happened to one of his children? Was there some kind of immigration problem? His papers were in order, but in today's climate, you never knew what might trigger unwanted attention. "I don't know, man. Some suit. Says it's important. Says he knows you." Carlos wiped his hands more thoroughly, suddenly aware of how he must smell, like dish soap and grease in the industrial kitchen that had been his second home for 3 years. He followed Tony through the busy kitchen, past the prep stations where vegetables were being chopped for the dinner service, past the line cooks who were already starting the complex process of sauce preparation. The dining room was beginning to fill with the lunch crowd, business people and executives enjoying expensive meals while discussing deals worth millions. The usual scene of wealth and privilege that Carlos observed from a distance every day. And there, standing near the hostess station like he belonged there, was Richard Blackstone. Not the gray, dying man from 3 weeks ago, but the powerful CEO again. His color had returned, his posture was strong and confident, and he was wearing a suit that probably cost more than Carlos made in 6 months. But something in his eyes had changed. There was a warmth there that Carlos had never seen before, a humanity that hadn't been visible in the business magazines or newspaper photos. "Carlos," Richard said, his voice carrying across the dining room with the confidence of someone accustomed to being heard. Several diners looked up curiously, wondering why the CEO was addressing kitchen staff by name. Carlos approached slowly, acutely aware of his stained apron, his damp hands, the way he must smell like the kitchen he'd just left. The contrast between them had never been more obvious. The successful businessman in his tailored suit and the dishwasher in his work clothes. Mr. Blackstone, Carlos said quietly, not wanting to attract more attention from the other diners. You look good. I'm glad you're okay. I'm more than okay, Richard replied, his voice firm with conviction. I'm alive because of you. Carlos glanced around nervously. The other restaurant staff were watching now, and some of the diners seemed to be listening to their conversation with curiosity. This wasn't the kind of attention Carlos was comfortable with. I just did what anyone would do, Carlos said, the same response he'd given that night, the same humble deflection that had gotten him through life. No, Richard said firmly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades making important decisions. You did what someone with character would do, and that's exactly why I'm here. Richard pulled out a thick manila envelope, the kind lawyers used for important documents. Carlos, I've been thinking about that night for 3 weeks, about how you didn't hesitate. You didn't worry about who I was or whether it was your job to help. You didn't think about liability or lawsuits or any of the things that stop people from acting. You just acted. Carlos stared at the envelope, his heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. Senor, I don't understand. I own a chain of restaurants called Apex Hospitality Group. We operate 15 high-end establishments across the Southeast, plus catering services and event management. Hotels, conference centers, the whole hospitality industry. I'm offering you a position as a regional kitchen operations director. The words hit Carlos like a physical blow. He'd been making $11 an hour washing dishes, working 60 hours a week between the restaurant and construction just to barely make ends meet. He'd been invisible, expendable, someone whose name no one bothered to learn. Regional director? Carlos stammered, the words feeling foreign in his mouth. Salary starts at $120,000 annually. Full benefits including health, dental, and vision for your entire family. Company car. Education assistance for your children. You'll oversee kitchen operations for all 15 restaurants and manage a team of over 200 employees. Carlos felt dizzy. $120,000 was more money than he'd ever imagined earning. It was more than his entire family made combined. It was the kind of salary that could change everything. Pay for Sophia's nursing school, help Elena quit one of her jobs, maybe even buy a house with a yard where his grandchildren could play. Mr. Blackstone, I don't speak good enough English for management. I don't have education for this kind of job. I just wash dishes. You have something more valuable than education, Richard said, his voice carrying conviction that made people at nearby tables look over with interest. You have integrity. You have the character to save a stranger's life without expecting anything in return. You have the work ethic to stay until 3 a.m. making sure every dish is clean. Carlos opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside were contracts, benefits packages, and a letter of recommendation that described him as a man of exceptional character and natural leadership ability. Legal documents that would transform his life if he had the courage to sign them. The dining room had gone quiet now. Even the servers had stopped what they were doing to watch this unprecedented scene. Maya stood at the center of it, holding documents that represented a future she'd never dared to imagine. Why? Carlos asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Why would you do this for someone like me? Because in 25 years of business, I've learned that the people who act when it matters most are the ones worth investing in. You didn't save my life hoping for a reward. You did it because it was right. That tells me everything I need to know about who you are. Carlos thought about Sophia's tuition bills that kept her awake at night, about Elena's car that needed constant repairs but couldn't be replaced, about the cramped apartment where he and Maria had lived for 8 years because they couldn't afford anything better, about all the dreams that had been deferred because survival took precedence over hope. I need to talk to my wife, Carlos said finally, his voice thick with emotion. Of course. Take all the time you need. But Carlos, I want you to know this isn't charity. This is business. I need someone I can trust, someone who understands the value of hard work and honest service. That night, Carlos sat at his small kitchen table with Maria, the envelope between them like a bridge to another life. They'd been married for 31 years, had weathered unemployment, illness, and the constant struggle of raising 5 children on minimum wage while maintaining their dignity and their faith in better days ahead. Read it to me again, Maria said, her eyes wide with disbelief and possibility. Carlos read through the contract slowly, translating the legal language into Spanish, making sure they both understood what this meant. $120,000 a year, health insurance for the whole family, a company car, education assistance that could pay for Sophia's nursing school and maybe help the grandchildren too. Es posible? Maria whispered. Is it really possible? I don't know, Carlos admitted, his voice heavy with decades of disappointment and false hope. I know how to wash dishes, how to work hard, how to show up every day. But managing people, running restaurants, making decisions that affect hundreds of employees? You've been managing this family for 30 years, Maria said firmly, reaching across the table to take his calloused hands in hers. You've worked 3 jobs at once to put food on the table. You've never given up, never complained, never let us see how tired you were. That's management. That's leadership. She squeezed his hands tighter. Carlos, you saved that man's life. Maybe this is God's way of saying it's time for our life to be saved too. Carlos's first day as regional kitchen operations director was terrifying. He sat in his new office, an actual office with windows and a view of downtown Atlanta, staring at organizational charts and budget spreadsheets that represented more money than he'd handled in his entire life. The numbers were overwhelming, intimidating, a reminder of how far outside his comfort zone he'd traveled. His assistant, a young woman named Jennifer who had a college degree and spoke confidently about profit margins and vendor relationships, knocked on his door. Mr. Mendoza? The kitchen managers are here for the weekly meeting. Carlos's stomach churned with nervous energy. He was about to meet with 15 people who had culinary degrees, people who'd been in management for years, people who probably wondered what a dishwasher was doing sitting at the head of their conference table. The meeting was awkward at first. The 15 kitchen managers were polite, but clearly skeptical. Carlos could see it in their eyes, in the way they exchanged glances when they thought he wasn't looking. What did a dishwasher know about running restaurant operations? But Carlos had spent 3 years in the kitchen at Bella Vista, and he'd worked in restaurants before that. He knew which equipment broke down most often and why. He knew which suppliers were reliable and which ones cut corners. He knew which dishes took the most time to prepare and which ingredients were most likely to be wasted. He knew the real cost of running a kitchen because he'd been part of that process every single day. I know what you're thinking, Carlos said finally, his accent thick with nervousness, but his voice growing stronger with each word. What's this guy doing here? He doesn't have culinary school. He doesn't have management experience. He doesn't even speak perfect English. He paused, looking around the room at their faces. You're right. I don't have those things. But I have something else. I know the work. He pulled out a notebook filled with observations he'd made over the years. Things he'd noticed during his shifts, problems he'd seen repeated, inefficiencies that cost money and wasted time. At Bella Vista, the dishwasher break down every 2 weeks because the drain get clogged with rice from the risotto. But maintenance, they just fix the machine, never clean the drain. So it happened again and again. The room was quiet now, people leaning forward to listen. The walk-in cooler, it run too cold because nobody adjusts it when seasons change. In summer, everything freeze solid. In winter, vegetables go bad too fast, cost money, waste food, make customers unhappy. Carlos spent the next hour going through his observations, sharing insights that came from actually doing the work rather than just managing it. By the end of the meeting, the managers were taking notes, asking questions, treating him not like an interloper, but like someone who might actually have valuable perspectives to offer. But Carlos's real education came in the weeks that followed. Working late in his office, reviewing vendor contracts and financial reports, he discovered something troubling. The numbers didn't add up in ways that went beyond simple bookkeeping errors. His experience in kitchens had taught him how much food really cost, how much waste was normal, and what equipment was necessary. Someone was inflating the numbers dramatically. Food orders showed premium prices for basic ingredients, equipment purchases for items that never appeared in the kitchens, waste reports that claimed losses far beyond what Carlos knew was normal for restaurant operations. The more Carlos looked, the more discrepancies he found. Someone had been embezzling from Apex Hospitality Group for years, using their access to purchasing systems and vendor relationships to systematically steal from the company. Carlos spent sleepless nights following paper trails, cross-referencing invoices, and quietly talking to kitchen staff at each location. He discovered fake vendor contracts, inflated prices, and missing inventory. It was a sophisticated scheme that had been carefully designed to stay below audit thresholds while steadily siphoning money from the company's profits. The scheme was well hidden and professionally executed. Someone with detailed knowledge of restaurant operations and access to the purchasing systems had been carefully stealing, staying just below the thresholds that would trigger automatic audits. But they hadn't counted on someone who actually knew the real cost of running a kitchen, someone who understood from personal experience what things should cost. When Carlos finally compiled his evidence, he requested a meeting with Richard. They met in Richard's office in Meridian Tower, the same building where Carlos had once washed dishes in anonymity, where he'd saved a man's life and changed the course of his own future. How much? Richard asked after reviewing Carlos's detailed report, his face growing darker with each page. Maybe 3 million, maybe more. Hard to say exactly because some records they missing or destroyed. Richard leaned back in his chair, his face grim with the realization of how deeply the betrayal ran. Do you know who's behind it? Carlos nodded reluctantly. He hadn't wanted to believe it, had hoped his suspicions were wrong. Your director of purchasing, Michael Stevens. He worked with 2 kitchen managers and somebody in accounting. They've been very careful, very smart, but they don't think Dishwasher knows real cost of food. Michael Stevens, Richard repeated, the name heavy with disappointment and anger. The man I've trusted for 6 years. The man who recommended against hiring you in the first place. Carlos felt his stomach drop with familiar fear. He what? When I announced your promotion, Michael came to me with concerns. First said you weren't qualified, that the other managers were upset about being passed over for someone without proper credentials. He suggested we find you a different position, something more appropriate for your background. Carlos felt the old anxiety creeping back, the fear that had haunted him through every job loss, every restructuring, every time someone had decided he was expendable. And what you tell him? Richard smiled grimly, but there was steel in his eyes. I told him I'd consider his concerns. Then I started paying much closer attention to his reports. The next morning, federal agents arrested Michael Stevens at his home before sunrise. The raids extended to his co-conspirators, freezing assets and seizing records. By afternoon, the story was breaking on business news networks, a multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme that had been operating for years under the noses of executives and auditors. Carlos stood in the Apex Hospitality Group conference room, watching the news coverage with a mixture of relief and lingering fear. Richard appeared beside him, his expression serious but satisfied. You know what this means? Richard asked. That maybe I need to find a new job again? Carlos replied, the old anxiety creeping back into his voice. In his experience, whistleblowers didn't usually get rewarded for exposing wrongdoing. That you're getting another promotion, Richard corrected, his voice firm with conviction. I'm making you director of operations for the entire company. You'll oversee not just the kitchens, but all restaurant operations across our entire portfolio. Carlos turned to face him, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was being offered. Mr. Blackstone, I'm grateful, but I still don't speak perfect English. I still don't have college education. You have something more valuable, Richard said. You have integrity that can't be taught and judgment that comes from real experience. You could have stayed quiet, collected your paycheck, and looked the other way. Instead, you risked everything to do what was right. But the other managers, they're not going to respect me. They're going to think it's not fair that I don't deserve this. The good ones will respect you because you earned it through your actions. The ones who don't probably shouldn't be here anyway. 6 months later, Carlos stood before a room full of restaurant industry professionals at the Georgia Restaurant Association's annual conference. He was delivering a keynote address on leadership through integrity, something that still felt surreal every time he thought about it. 1 year ago, I was washing dishes for $11 an hour, he began, his accent still thick, but his voice steady with hard-won confidence. Today, I'm responsible for restaurants that serve thousands of people every day. But the most important thing I learned, it's not about money or position or having your name on business card. It's about doing what's right. He paused, looking out at the audience of chefs, managers, and restaurant owners. People who had achieved success through education and experience. People who belonged in this world in ways he was still learning. Character, it's what you do when nobody watching. When you're alone with dying man, when you find out somebody's stealing, when you have to choose between easy thing and right thing. The audience was completely silent, hanging on his words. I didn't save Mr. Blackstone because I want reward. I do it because it's right thing to do. But what I learn is when you do right thing, even when it's hard, even when it's scary, life sometimes give you opportunities you never imagined possible. My daughter Sophia, she finished nursing school now. She work at Children's Hospital, helping sick kids get better. My daughter Elena, she don't need to clean 3 hotels anymore. She manage hotel properties now, using her experience to help other workers. My son Miguel, he start his own business with loan I cosign. We buy a house with yard where grandchildren can play and be safe. Carlos's voice caught slightly with emotion. But most important thing, it's not what I gained. It's what I learned. That where you come from, it don't matter. What language you speak first, it don't matter. How much school you have, it don't matter. What matters is what's in your heart and how you treat other people. After his speech, Carlos received dozens of job offers, consulting requests, and speaking opportunities. Other companies wanted to hire him. Headhunters called with promises of even higher salaries. But he stayed with Apex Hospitality Group, continuing to build a culture of integrity and opportunity. He implemented programs to promote from within, preferring to hire people who understood the work from the ground up rather than just those with impressive credentials. He established English classes for Spanish-speaking employees taught by volunteers from local colleges. He created pathways for advancement that valued character and work ethic over education credentials, giving opportunities to people who reminded him of himself. A year later, Carlos received a call that brought tears to his eyes and reminded him why all the struggle had been worthwhile. Papa, Sophia said, excitement bubbling in her voice like champagne. They promoted me to charge nurse in the pediatric cardiac unit. Mira, that's wonderful, Carlos replied, his eyes filling with tears of pride and gratitude. Papa, you know what the doctor tell me when they give me the promotion? What's that, mi amor? He say they choose me because I have heart like my father, because I show them that caring about people is more important than anything else they teach in school. He say they want nurses who understand that healing start with compassion, not just with medicine. Carlos sat in his office, looking out at the Atlanta skyline where he'd once been invisible, where he'd once scrubbed dishes while dreaming of better days for his children. He learned that sometimes the smallest acts of courage create the biggest changes, not just for yourself, but for everyone around you. Because when you choose to do what's right, even when no one is watching, even when you have everything to lose and nothing obvious to gain, you don't just change your own life, you change the world. The following year, Carlos established the Second Chances program, providing job training and advancement opportunities for immigrants, formerly incarcerated individuals, and others who had been overlooked by traditional hiring practices. The program's motto, printed in both English and Spanish, read, El character no tiene acento, character has no accent. At the program's first graduation ceremony, Carlos stood before 60 participants, people who had been dismissed by society, overlooked by employers, written off as having nothing valuable to offer. Now they were heading to management positions, culinary schools, and business ownership opportunities. You are not defined by your past, Carlos told them in both languages, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had lived these words. You are not defined by your accent, your education, or what other people think you can do. You are defined by your character, your effort, and your heart. As the ceremony ended and families celebrated their loved ones' achievements, Carlos felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Richard Blackstone, now not just his boss, but his close friend and business partner in these community initiatives. You know what you've done here? Richard asked, gesturing toward the celebrating families. What's that? You've created a movement. These people will succeed, and they'll remember that someone believed in them when no one else would. They'll pass that belief on to others. The impact will multiply for generations. Carlos looked out at the celebrating families, people who had struggled with language barriers, discrimination, and limited opportunities, now seeing their loved ones step into leadership roles and promising futures. I just do what feels right in my heart, Carlos said simply. That's exactly the point, Richard replied. You always do what feels right. That's what makes you extraordinary. Later that evening, Carlos called his wife Maria from his office, watching the sun set over the city where he'd built a new life through one moment of courage. How did it go? She asked, her voice warm, with the comfort of 33 years of marriage. Beautiful. 60 people starting new lives. 60 families celebrating. And how do you feel? Carlos paused, thinking about the journey from that night in the restaurant to this moment. I feel grateful. Grateful that I was in the right place at the right time. Grateful that I choose to act instead of walk away. You know what I'm grateful for? Maria said. What's that, mi amor? That I married a man who would leave his dishes to save a stranger's life. That's who you've always been, Carlos. The promotion, the money, the recognition, that's all wonderful. But you've always been the man who does what's right, no matter what it costs. Carlos wiped away a tear, touched by her words and the truth they contained. Te amo, mi vida. Te amo también. Now come home. I made your favorite arroz con pollo. As Carlos drove home through the Atlanta streets, he passed Meridian Tower. The building was lit up against the night sky, and he could see the restaurant on the 40th floor where someone else was now washing dishes. Someone else was invisible to the wealthy diners. Someone else was working $4.11 an hour while dreaming of something better. Carlos said a silent prayer for that person, hoping they would find their own moment of courage, their own opportunity to change everything. Because he'd learned that heroes aren't born with special powers or privileges. They're made in moments when ordinary people choose to do extraordinary things, when they choose to see the humanity in others, even when the world looks through them. And sometimes, if you're very lucky and if you do what's right even when no one is watching, even when you have everything to lose, the world decides to see you back. That night, Carlos tucked his grandchildren into bed in the house he'd been able to buy because a moment of courage had changed everything. As he read them stories in both Spanish and English, he thought about the lesson he wanted them to remember. Mijo, he told his youngest grandson, remember that it doesn't matter how much money someone has or what kind of clothes they wear. What matters is how they treat people when no one important is watching. That's how you know what kind of person they really are. Like when you help the sick man, abuelo? Sí, mi amor, like that. If you believe kindness should be rewarded like this, give Carlos a like and share in the comments where you're watching from, someone near you.